Hey everyone, if you don't know me, I finished top 10 in Constructed playing my favorite format, Timeless, and today I want to talk to everybody about Surgical Extraction. Surgical Extraction is a very powerful card in Timeless, but it is a very difficult card to understand exactly why and how you should use it, and I see a lot of players on Arena misplaying with it, so I'm going to make this video where we're going to talk about Surgical Extraction as objectively as possible and explain the good and bad plays with it so that hopefully everybody learns something about Magic. So first of all, I have tricked you into watching a PowerPoint in your spare time. And in order to break this down objectively and not just call everybody boneheads for doing it wrong, we're going to talk about surgical extraction in terms of actual quantities and numbers. We're going to talk about mana advantage, card advantage, tempo. We're going to evaluate surgical plays on all of these, looking at positive use cases. And we're actually just going to forget about the extraction part of the card for right now, because that's very hard to evaluate in terms of objective numbers. So here's a first use case of Reanimate that's very common in Timeless. Reanimate is a big card in the meta right now, and people love to reanimate big things like Atraxa to cheat on mana significantly. So if you have a surgical extraction in your hand and you're playing against this kind of a deck, the correct play will be to wait for your opponent to cast Reanimate, targeting something in the graveyard, and then you use your surgical, targeting whatever they are targeting. In this case, you're going to exile Atraxa before Reanimate can bring it back, which will fizzle the Reanimate. What's the result of this in terms of our objective numbers? Well, first we got a mana advantage. Our opponent spent 1 mana on the Reanimate, and we spent 2 life on Surgical Extraction. This gives us mana positive +1. It's also card neutral. We spent 1 card to counter one of their cards. So you can almost use Surgical Extraction as a 0 mana counter spell here, which, if you ask a Legacy player, they'll tell you about Mental Misstep and its Reign of Terror before it was banned. This is also very tempo positive, and the reason is because Timeless players are often going to try to reanimate Atraxa very early, like on turn 2 or turn 3, to be super degenerate. The thing is, if on turn 2 or turn 3 you spend one of your mana on Reanimate and it gets countered, you aren't going to have your full mana to do whatever other play that you have in your hand. So on turn 3 you could have cast a 3-drop, but what you did instead is you cast a Reanimate, it got countered, now you only have 2 mana left. So you can only play a 2-drop at best. This puts our opponent behind on board, and we can call this tempo positive for us because we were able to successfully slow down our opponent just by casting a 0 mana surgical extraction to counter what they were doing. Now let's think of another use case. Let's say you Thoughtseize your opponent. You're playing a deck that has both Thoughtseize and surgical extraction in it, and you're up against a show and tell player. Look at that. You see 2 show and tells in their hand, and you say, oh man, I really wish I could discard both of them. Well, with the magic of surgical extraction, you totally can. So you're going to target the first show and tell with your Thoughtseize. That thing's going to go to the graveyard, and then you can surgical extraction it from there. When you surgical the show and tell out of the graveyard, it will also remove this one from your opponent's hand. If you read surgical carefully, your opponent doesn't get to draw any cards as compensation for when this happens. So, in this case, surgical extraction just became another copy of Thoughtseize. We got to remove a targeted card from our opponent's hand because they had a copy of it in their graveyard. So in this case, it was mana neutral. We spent 0 mana on the surgical. They didn't spend any mana because they didn't actually cast this show and tell, right? It's card neutral, 1 card versus 1 card. I traded my 1 surgical for their 1 show and tell. But this is a really good play for us because it disrupted our opponent. View this as the exact same way as Thoughtseize itself. This is actually the same thing but better. Thoughtseize is mana negative. You spent 1 mana to accomplish the exact same play. Now, of course, you surgical as a Thoughtseize, you do need a bit of setup. Your opponent needs to have multiple copies of the same card, one in their graveyard, one in their hand, and the card does have to get to the graveyard, and you do need the information on your opponent's hand, so you pretty much need another discard spell to make that happen. But whenever this opportunity presents itself for you to use surgical extraction as a Thoughtseize effect, I think that's fantastic because people are very happy to pay 1 mana and 2 life to get rid of an important card in your opponent's hand. How about you spend 0 mana and 2 life? That's great. So let's continue the scenario. Remember that show and tell player that we just ripped the 2 show and tells out of their hand? Well, this is what's left in their hand. They got a tutor and they have 3 polluted deltas for mana. Our opponent is, of course, going to play one of the polluted deltas for their turn to get mana, crack it, and put it in their graveyard. So what happens if we have a second surgical here? Well, we just hit the surgical extraction nut draw here. This is the best possible use case for surgical when you're not actually taking something valuable out of your opponent's deck. So here, we just use surgical's mind rot. We traded 1 card for 2 cards, getting us card advantage. This completely destroys their hand. It might completely mana screw them. If we were taking out a non-land card, it would also seriously screw them up. And we essentially got a 2-card discard for 0 mana, which is fantastic because usually the going rate for 2 cards of discard is 3 mana. Hymn to Torok is insanely busted at 2 mana, right? So 0 mana is certainly insane. This is a amazing pull for you. Like, it'll pull you way ahead in the game. It'll make your opponent stumble seriously. The only issue with this is that it does require a lot of luck and a lot of setup. You do need to have the information on what's in your opponent's hand. You can't just like randomly surgical polluted delta and hope that your opponent has one in their hand, because they only have 4 copies in their deck, and if one's already in the graveyard, that means there's 3 copies in the deck only. What are the odds that they have multiple polluted deltas in their hand without you being able to see that first? It's not very likely. However, when the situation does present itself, this is objectively a good play, and we can evaluate it in terms of card advantage, mana advantage, and say, wow, this is so much better than Mind Rot or Hymn to Torok, therefore it's a really, really good play. Up next, let's actually talk about the extraction part of the card, because this is the real reason you run it. Sure, you can run it as a 0 mana graveyard counterspell, but really, the reason it packs a punch in Timeless is because it can permanently remove a card from your opponent's deck. And this, I think, is where a lot of people get tripped up, because they see, oh, I can remove my opponent's best card. I'm just going to do that generically everywhere. And that's not a good thing to do. But it is really strong when it's good. Let's go ahead and play a clip of me ruining a show and tell player's day. I've sped this clip up a little bit, but we start this game off with a Grief Ephemerate Scam, which is an absolutely amazing start against show and tell, of course. And we get to discard our choices of cards. On turn 1, we get to discard their combo piece and a tutor. We leave them with a counter spell in hand, saying either, hey, we're going to discard the counter, or they'll just counter my spell on the stack. I'm super fine to see my spell countered, and now we're at the point where we're beating them down to Grief, and we're hoping that we can beat them down before they can actually assemble their combo. But then off the deck coming up soon, after we get a chance to Grief Scam them again for even more information, we get blessed by a top deck Surgical Extraction next turn. A little bit of a spoiler alert here. So when we top deck the Surgical here, I spend a little bit of time mulling over it, and I actually get to use the Surgical both on discard mode and remove your win condition mode, where I get to pull an Omniscience out of their hand. I use Grief to discard everything not named Omniscience, and then I pull the Omniscience right out of their hand, and we get a Salty Scoop out of them, and that was just glorious. All right, so you saw that show and tell opponent just got scammed. They got destroyed. They got taken out of the game, and they didn't get to have fun. Only I got to have fun. And we got to surgical them and then surgical them again to deliver the absolute knockout blow a couple of turns later. Now, this is awesome. Who doesn't like taking the show and tell player out of the game? However, there's a couple of problems with this strategy. First, the card that you want to surgical actually needs to get to your opponent's graveyard, which is an ask. That means one of these 4 things need to happen. You either need to make them discard it with like a Grief or a Thoughtseize. You need to counter it on the stack with a counter spell. They need to mill it, or they need to discard it themselves voluntarily, which doesn't often happen. And keep in mind, Surgical's a sideboard card. Your opponent's going to pack their own sideboard cards. They're going to play Defense Grid to turn off those counter spells. They're going to play Leyline to turn off those discard spells. And they're going to play Veil of Summer to turn off any sort of interaction. And you're going to often find difficulty putting cards in graveyards, especially if you're playing against combo deck like Goblin Charbelcher that doesn't need to put cards into the graveyard. You're never going to be able to surgical extraction this card, because they main deck 4 of the Leyline of Sanctities, and they will max out on Veil of Summers when they're against a discard deck. So good luck. However, against graveyard-based combo decks, surgical extraction is still fantastic, because graveyard-based combo decks are going to voluntarily discard the cards themselves or mill the cards. So let's say you're up against Shift and Tell. Shift and Tell is a meta deck in Timeless right now where we are going to copy up Omniscience with Shifting Woodland. So our opponent is trying to get a 4-mana Omniscience. If you get Omniscience into play, you win the game in Timeless. It is that simple. So we need to prevent that from happening. So let's say we see Omniscience get put into the graveyard. On turn 2, our opponent casts Malevolent Rumble or Cash Grab, and they just put the Omniscience into their graveyard. We can surgically it right then and there. So let's talk about it in terms of objective value. What are we getting when we surgical that Omniscience as soon as it goes to the graveyard? It's mana neutral. We spend 0 mana, they spend 0 mana. Okay, we spend 2 life, but it doesn't matter in a combo matchup. It's card disadvantage for us, sure. We spent 1 card, they lost 0 cards out of their hand, and it's tempo neutral. It doesn't impact the tempo or the board state. However, we get to extract their primary win condition out of their deck, which is huge. Of course, Shift and Tell decks still have other ways to win, but taking out their main route to victory is going to be a big, big win for us, and this is still a good play. This is still a fine use of a sideboard card. I'm going to tell you guys, you can actually make it a lot better. What you should do instead is wait for your opponent to spend 4 mana on the Shifting Woodlands to copy up Omniscience and then Surgical in response. In this case, we get the same stuff as before, except this is a mana positive exchange. We spend 0 mana, or maybe 1 mana if we choose not to spend life, and they spent 4 mana on the Shifting Woodland. It is a huge tempo win. 4 mana is often your whole turn's mana in Timeless. Our opponent might have spent an entire turn, all the resources that they had, on the Shifting Woodland to put all the mana into it to copy up that Omniscience, and we just said no. We essentially skipped their turn. And we still extracted the win condition, which is unbelievably good. So you could see how waiting until the absolute last second with this card will often benefit you. So, like I said, huge tempo swing if you wait until the last possible second to surgical your opponent's win con, instead of surgicling it as soon as it shows up. And, you can waste your whole opponent's turn in the best possible case, like if they're spending the 4 mana on turn 4. However, there's a con is your opponent could draw a counterspell to defend themselves. They could draw a defense grid, but you can always surgical in response to them casting defense grid, so it's not really the end of the world. I still do recommend waiting as long as possible with surgical extraction in order to actually properly use it, because if you're going to argue, oh, your opponent can go ahead and draw counterspells, well, then I can draw more discard and draw more surgicals to keep them under control. All right, so now let's go ahead and talk about some negative use cases here. And we got the surgical extraction pointing at Guide of Souls. Seasoned Timeless players will recognize this as a silly play, and no, I'm not exaggerating. I'm going to go ahead and play the clip here. I played against a mill opponent, and this is what they decided to do to me when I was on energy. So, after milling me, my opponent decided to surgical extraction my Guide of Souls here, and note that this is indeed game 2. You can see I won game 1, so my opponent had the opportunity to sideboard, and they decided that surgical extraction on Guide of Souls was indeed the correct play. And what's interesting is that my opponent decides to double down a few turns later, even surgical extracting the Ajani out of my deck. All right, so let's talk about why exactly what my opponent did was bad objectively. The surgical extraction player spent either 4 life or 2 mana to extract 2 cards from a graveyard. Now, usually I assume the life doesn't matter because I assume we're playing against a combo deck, but against energy, where they are beating you down and trying to kill you fairly, that 4 life is going to matter. However, the energy player, they spent 0 mana and 0 life to be a part of this exchange. It was card disadvantage on the part of the surgical extraction deck. They spent 2 cards out of their hand to rip 0 cards out of the hand of the energy player, and it had no impact on tempo. Like, there was nothing removed from the board state, the energy player didn't have to waste mana on anything, nothing happened. And the extraction part of this card is not going to be good here. Why? Let's say we extract a Johnny and look at the other cards that are in energy. Well, it looks like energy is literally just a pile of creatures in removal. The energy player is just likely to draw another dorky 2 mana creature. It doesn't matter if the 2 mana creature is a Johnny or Amped Raptor or Bowmasters. You're going to die the same if your opponent can draw a critical density of those creatures. And if you wouldn't know, this is what happened to the opponent from the video. They just died to Amped Raptor and Bowmasters and Flage after they took out my 2 best cards. This goes back to an important point that I like to repeat because I play energy a lot and it's my main deck for grinding. The strength of these fast fair decks like energy is redundancy and resiliency. Every card in energy is the same. It's literally just a pile of efficient creatures and removal. If you get discarded, you're very likely to just draw another efficient creature or removal spell. In fact, that's like your whole deck in addition to lands. So your deck will always top deck well. Everything is similar to every other card in your deck. So getting discarded and getting extracted is not a problem at all for you. All right, so let's do the math really quick. I said my opponent made a boneheaded play, but let's mathematically prove it. So opponent is extracting a Johnny from my deck to prevent me from drawing it in the future. That is the goal of surgical extraction. Well, let's think about it this way. Assume there's 50 cards left in my deck. There was a bit less because they're a mill deck, of course, But in normal scenarios, your opponent's going to have about 50 cards left, and in those 50 cards, there's going to be a maximum of 3 Ajanis, because keep in mind, at least one of them has to be in the graveyard already. So if you plug that math into a calculator, that means the odds of any particular card out of those 50 being an Ajani is only about 6%, meaning that each turn your opponent had a 6% chance to draw an Ajani, and you're removing that 6% chance. But 6% is really, really small. If you use a hypergeometric calculator and you ask it, hey, over 5 turns, how likely was your opponent to draw an Ajani before it was removed? The answer is still only 27%. And the energy deck is absolutely going to kill you in 5 turns or less if you're taking time off to surgical. Honestly, 5 turns can be quite generous for how long you have left to live against energy. So my opponent here went ahead and spent a card and possibly spent mana or life to have a 27% at most chance of impacting me. And as we said before, there's a lot of redundancy in the deck, so just removing one creature out of the deck doesn't really impact my ability to win. I'm very likely to just draw another creature. Sure, I can draw a land instead of the Ajani, but we're talking about very tiny percentage points in a situation where you're already getting beat down, the energy player already has creatures in play, and you're losing life every single turn. So my opponent did absolutely nothing to advance the board state or advance their game plan here. So to conclude this video, here's all of my main points so we don't forget. You should try to use Surgical if it gives you a mana or a tempo advantage. For example, Surgicaling a Reanimate, that's going to give you a 1 mana advantage. You should use Surgical if it's analogous to Thoughtseize, meaning you have info on your opponent's hand, i.e. you cast Thoughtseize, you see a card, 2 copies of it, and then you Surgical it to discard the second copy. You should use it to extract their win condition in a graveyard-based combo deck. You really can't rely on this in combo decks that don't put their cards into the graveyard unless you are playing a very strong discard strategy like Grief Scam, but you can use it against graveyard combo decks like Shift and Tell very easily. You should wait until the last minute to Surgical, generally. Sometimes you're going to want to play around counter magic by doing it immediately on your own main phase while your opponent is tapped out. However, if you wait until the last minute, you can do that last bullet point and do it in response to your opponent performing a game action. For example, the Shift and Tell player spending 4 mana to try and copy Omniscience, you make them waste that 4 mana. For example, a Reanimate player trying to reanimate their Atraxa, you essentially counterspell the Reanimate and make them waste a card from their hand. As for the do nots, you should not use Surgical to just remove any good card in your opponent's deck. You should not main deck the Surgical Extraction, and you should not fool yourself into thinking that this card is generically good versus all decks. As we saw in that last game, my opponent Surgicaled the best 2 cards in energy. They got the Guide of Souls and the Ajani out of the deck, and they still just lost to the other energy cards. So please don't fool yourself into thinking that Surgical Extraction and extraction effects are good against every sort of deck. You also should not Surgical hoping to hit cards in your opponent's hand without the information. You really should play a card like Thoughtseize or maybe something more marginal like Sorcerous Spyglass that's colorless to look at your opponent's hand and get the information before you commit to a play like that. And lastly, I've said this before, but I'm going to say it again. Extracting a fair deck's best card is mathematically not worth it. Not only is it only like a 27% chance to impact the energy deck that we calculated on the previous slide, but the impact is really small. They're just going to draw another similar card. It is not the same as removing a win condition from a combo deck, because the combo deck cannot replace that win condition once it's out of their deck. Alright, if you found this video helpful or you know somebody who is struggling on the arena ladder, please send them this video. I really think it has a lot of good information for people to learn from. I don't think the average player spends a lot of time thinking about, mana advantage and card advantage when using a sideboard card like Surgical Extraction. So hopefully my explanations were really good, and hopefully I helped you out.